It is currently 19 degrees outside. It was 15 degrees when I woke up this morning. It is very cold. And January is typically the time of the year where I don't really go out and shoot very much because it is so cold outside. Surprisingly, I would say I've actually done pretty well this year. I've probably shot more photos this January than I have the past couple Januaries combined. And I've gotten a lot of photos that I'm actually really happy with. But right now we are in the middle of a massive cold front, and to me at least, it is way too cold to actually go out and take any photos. Now, since the beginning of the year does have a lot of downtime, I like to spend that time deciding on what I want to focus on with my photography in the upcoming year. Recently, I found myself really simplifying the way I shoot by worrying less about the camera settings and focusing more on improving the subject matter and the framing and the composition of my photos. And the main way I've been able to have this worry less and shoot more approach to my photography is by simply putting my camera in Aperture Priority. This has become one of my favorite modes to shoot in, whether I'm shooting street photography or just taking random photos of my cat. Because I've noticed I'm way more likely to get the shot in Aperture Priority because I'm not wasting time adjusting my shutter speed or my ISO. So my keeper rate has gone up dramatically compared to when I've shot in manual in the past. Now let me just clarify that there are always times where you're probably going to want to shoot in manual, but I found personally for me probably 90% of the time, Aperture Priority gets the job done very well. So in this video, I want to share some of my favorite settings that I've recently found for the Sony A7CR. So I just want to take you guys through some of those settings for Aperture Priority that actually makes it good. Otherwise, if you're not using these settings, you may be setting yourself up for disaster. Now, technically, there's not a right way or a wrong way to set up your camera. It all comes down to personal preference. But for me, the goal was to essentially set up my camera in an automated way where it would do for me what I would normally do if I was shooting in manual. If you set your camera in Aperture Priority, of course you are deciding the aperture that you want to shoot at, but you're letting the camera decide the shutter speed, which is normally fine, but if you're in a dark environment like indoors, for example, chances are it will probably drop your shutter speed down to around like 1/10 of a second, no matter what your aperture is set to, no matter how wide open it is. And while this camera does have great image stabilization, if you're not paying close attention and you're not holding the camera still enough, chances are your photo is going to come out blurry and not very sharp. The easy fix to this is setting your camera to auto ISO. Set the range limit to whatever ISO you feel comfortable with. For me, it's a minimum of 100 and a maximum of 3200. And the most important step is to set your auto ISO minimum shutter speed. For me, I find 1/125th to be the best balance of letting in plenty of light and preventing too much motion blur in a shot. Just make sure you set your exposure compensation to whatever you want, whether you want it to underexpose just a little bit to help preserve some detail in the highlights, or maybe you want to overexpose to help lift some of the shadows. Personally, I found that setting the meter to 0 or underexposed by about 0.3 stops usually tends to have the best results. Now, thankfully, the A7CR can be quite forgiving when it comes to dynamic range and recovering details, which is quite surprising for such a high-resolution sensor. And the last thing in regards to exposure control, you want to set your AEL, which I think stands for Auto Exposure Lock. I could totally be wrong, but it makes sense to me, so that's what I'm going to go with. You want to set your AEL to either hold or toggle. Personally, for me, I found that setting it to toggle works better and it's just more convenient. Although you do have to make sure that you don't accidentally leave it on, but there is a star in the corner of your screen that you will probably notice when you do have the auto exposure lock on. And I'm proud to say that for the first time in 10 years, I've actually found a use for the custom button on the side of most Sony lenses, and that is usually where I just keep my auto exposure lock assigned to. So let me just explain what auto exposure lock actually does. It basically just holds the settings that your camera is currently set to, because depending on the meter that you're using, whether it's center or multi, I personally prefer multi when it comes to using Aperture Priority. Sometimes in a high contrast scene where you have dark shadows and bright highlights, it will auto expose somewhere in the middle, but it usually tends to gravitate toward protecting those highlights. So your shadows may look quite dark, but you don't always want that. And that's when you may want to use the auto exposure lock. And the last thing I want to note is that recently I've actually started using a set white balance rather than using the auto white balance. For a long time, I never saw the point in using a set white balance on a camera that shoots RAW because you can usually just fix that and correct that in Lightroom. But I found that by setting the white balance, your photos start to become a lot more consistent and you don't have to do as much editing and tweaking in between shots to try and get them to match up. Personally, I like to set mine to 6700 Kelvin because I've noticed that Sony cameras tend to gravitate toward a little bit of a cooler image, and I don't want my shadows to be as blue necessarily a lot of the time. And at around 6700, it's a very nice balance, especially when you are shooting outside. When you are shooting any kind of indoors, the 6700 Kelvin might be a little too much, so that's when I would probably drop it. But otherwise, when you're shooting outdoors, whether that's in sunny or cloudy lighting conditions, 6700 usually gets the job done very well. Now, whether you are following along and saving these same settings to your camera or not, if you are, this is the point that I would recommend saving these settings to your camera set memory and assigning it to one of the dials on the top of your camera, probably one. Now, the reason I would recommend doing this rather than sticking to the actual Aperture Priority dial on the top of the camera is because I found that if I'm bouncing back and forth between Aperture Priority and manual, I may forget to turn on the auto ISO when I am shooting in Aperture Priority. And that way you're actually saving a little bit of time because the manual and Aperture Priority are separated by your shutter priority. So by saving it to one, you only have one little switch between the manual and the one custom settings. And for my number 2, I have it set to shooting panoramic style photos. And the only setting I changed was the aspect marker, setting it to 2.35 and the marker level to 15. And you can have a lot of fun playing around with shooting X-Pan style images. If you want to get the full experience, I would recommend using a 24mm lens. I could dive a little bit deeper, but I think I'm going to be saving that for a future video. The only thing to keep in mind is that when you do import the photos into Lightroom, you will have to crop them because it is going to show the standard 3:2 format. And for my number 3 dial, I have it set to shooting in black and white. And for this one, I'm actually actively working on a video about shooting in black and white, but lately I've been really enjoying shooting in black and white because I've found that shooting in black and white really changes my shooting style and mentality when it comes to the way I compose my images. Just keep in mind that unless you're shooting JPEGs, when you import the RAW files into Lightroom, they will still be in color, so you will have to convert them to black and white later. Now, if you want the true monochrome experience, you're probably gonna have to go buy a Leica, but in the meantime, I recommend trying this out because it's a really refreshing way to take photos. So those are my favorite settings for the Sony A7CR, and truthfully, you could follow along and use these settings on pretty much any Sony camera or any camera in general. So those are the settings I will probably be using for the most part this year, and only switching to manual in very specific scenarios. And if you're curious about my mentality of switching from manual to shooting with Aperture Priority, I did post another video a couple months ago that goes a little bit more in depth and explains why I decided to make this decision. So I would recommend heading over to my channel and watching that video as well. And if you're looking for a video that maybe goes a little bit more in depth on the general settings for the Sony A7C II or the A7CR, I have multiple videos on my channel going over photography settings and video settings. Now, of course, I made those videos about a year ago, so some of my opinions have changed and those are reflected in this video. I just wanted to make this video so I could dive in a little bit deeper and share some of the creative ways I plan on using this camera and spicing up my photography just a little bit in the upcoming year, whether that's shooting more panoramic style images or just shooting in black and white. Because when you have those settings easily accessible to you, especially here on the top dial, it really promotes you and makes you actually want to shoot in those creative ways more often. So thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe to help support the channel. And I hope I could inspire you guys to get out and take more photos. Go out and shoot.